We are now moving forward to herein the 6th Commandment, and specifically in the broader reading that we've had here in Deuteronomy chapter 5, we are focusing specifically on verse 17. You shall not murder. Like last week when we saw the positive command, the positive law as it's known, to honour your mother and father, it seems fairly straightforward and obvious, and of course on the surface we, hopefully, at least as far as I'm aware, don't have anyone who's been imprisoned recently for homicide. And even if you had been, you are most welcome, because the grace of God, of course, does cleanse all sins. But what we are seeing here today is again much like what we saw last week, a seemingly simplistic or simple prima facie understanding or surface level understanding that also contains within it a far deeper, greater and more profound meaning. That dichotomy, not in opposition to each other, but symbiotically held together between the letter of the law and what Christ and the apostles refer to as the spirit of the law, the deeper meaning behind the law. In fact, with this very command, we see this as one of the short selections that are chosen in regards to the Sermon on the Mount, delivered in Matthew, most famously, of course, by Christ, where he says, "You have heard it said, you shall not murder, but I say unto you this day, that if you have anger or hatred toward your brother in your heart, you have already murdered him." And he gives an exposition on that deeper, more spiritual level of the law itself, and that is just one of the many instances in which there is a greater depth that we see play out, not only in the New Testament, but also throughout the Old Testament, concerning this very specific command against murder. In simple form or understanding, it should be understood, just to get those simple elements not necessarily out of the way, but I suppose covered. There is a definitive biblical difference between what we might in English say as murder or killing. There is a difference between the intentional and unjustified taking of a human life and life that is taken in the defense of either yourself or of loved ones, of family, life that is taken in the context of a just war, etc., etc., etc. The death penalty instituted by the state against murderers is described ubiquitously and unanimously throughout the scriptures as the just penalty for homicide. And so if you've ever wondered, why do some translations read murder, why do some read kill? The old King James, for example, would read you shall not kill. Here in most modern translations will read murder. There is a definitive difference between simply killing at all versus intentional homicide. But because, as is being consistently our understanding and more importantly our approach here throughout this series on the 10 Commandments, we are dealing with the deeper, weightier, more spiritual matters of the law, and we are applying them, as we have been consistently doing, to the things in our time. We exist in a culture of death, a culture that commits and abides and indeed glorifies and celebrates death, both in the literal homicidal sense as well as in the more abstract intellectual or spiritual sense also. And it might be helpful for us, in fact, to actually open to the Old Testament reading that we had earlier in the liturgy from the very first chapter of Isaiah. I'd like to walk us through that portion of Scripture to then establish for us a lot of the groundwork and the foundation for what we'll be understanding and expositing here this morning. Isaiah begins this particular chapter with an opening or remark, an incipit as it's called, describing essentially the title, as it were, of this rather lengthy book, one of the major prophets as he's referred to, not by virtue of his significance necessarily, although Isaiah was very significant in his day and beyond. The major prophets are referred to as such by virtue of the length of their books. Herein Isaiah being one of those, and he begins by explaining the verse 1, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, concerning Judah and Jerusalem, which he beheld in the days of Uzziah, of Jotham, of Ahaz, and of Hezekiah, kings of Judah. This, roughly speaking, covers the period of the late 8th and the early 7th centuries BC. Okay, so the late 700s, early 600s, and he comes to fruition during the very latter years of the reign of Uzziah the king, and then ministers throughout the land through the reign of his three successors, of course ending with Hezekiah, who we have referenced in weeks past as a righteous and honourable king, and one of the most righteous kings of Israel, held up there with one of his successors about a century after him, King Josiah. He is in fact regarded in the scriptures, at least in terms of those who wrote in the day, as being the greatest king of those who would come before or come after. And part of that reason will be because of exactly what we'll see here throughout our time here this morning. But writing then, he comes right out of the gate with something that not only applies to the time of King Uzziah, but would especially apply in the days of King Ahaz, one of the most wicked and corrupt and contemptible rulers in the history of then the divided kingdoms. Reading from verse 2 through to verse 9, I want to provide commentary, not a great in-depth exposition, which would take up much of our time, but I want to comment on some things and then draw parallel to what we'll be focusing on here this morning. In verse 2, as this opening remarks of Isaiah the prophet begin, "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord speaks. He is calling heaven and earth to bear witness to the words that he is about to proclaim, to the words that God is going to speak and proclaim through him under the inspiration of the Spirit. He is calling all of the cosmos, all of creation itself. He is calling not only the material creation, but also the spiritual creation. He is calling all powers, be they on earth or in the heavens, to bear witness to what is being said." And in verse 2 he continues and says, "Sons I have reared up and raised up, but they have transgressed against me." Here the Lord begins to speak. Sons I have reared and raised up, but they have transgressed against me. He's talking about his own people. And of course, much of what Isaiah addresses, not all, but much of what Isaiah addresses is specifically for and to the people of his day, of course, and he references others as well. He references the Egyptians, the references elsewhere to the nations around them, but much of the problem that existed in the land in that late 8th, early 7th century when Isaiah is alive concerned the people and their relationship with the nations around them, and this is something which will come forth as we progress. Verse 3, "An ox knows its owner, and a donkey knows its master's manger. But Israel does not know, my people do not perceive." Even the animals know and obey their masters and their handlers and those who keep them. But my people, they don't know me anymore. My people, they do not perceive me. This is not only an insult righteously by design, but it is meant to be shocking and confronting. Much of what the purpose of the prophets were, of which Isaiah is one of the archetypal examples, is the employ of what we refer to in theological terms as dramatic prophetic hyperbole. Shocking, vivid, blunt language that is meant to, in no uncertain terms, strike at the heart and beat over the head. It is both a blunt instrument and a piercing dagger. In verse 4, "Alas, sinful nation, people heavy with iniquity, with evil, with sin, with wickedness, seed of evildoers, sons who act corruptly. They have forsaken the Lord, they have spurned the Holy One of Israel, they have become estranged from him." They have forsaken, they have spurned, they have become estranged. During the reign of those four kings, Uzziah included, and especially Ahaz, with the exception of Hezekiah, who brings in reforms, praise be to God, we find in that time, and this is outlined largely in the book of the Kings, as well as partly in Chronicles, but primarily in Kings here, that great evil dwelt in the land. It dwelt not only in the northern kingdom, which at this time had been, certainly by the time you get toward the end of Isaiah's life, conquered by the Assyrian Empire, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The southern kingdom, what we refer to as the kingdom of Judah, also had slowly and increasingly, but surely, eventually by the days of King Ahaz, been engrossed in the wickedness and idolatry and the paganism of their neighbours. There was, in no uncertain terms, no distinction anymore en masse between the worship of the pagans around them, the Canaanites, the Edomites, the Moabites, the Philistines, the Assyrians, etc., and the worship of God's people. They were conducting abominations in the temple. They were committing sacrifices, human sacrifices, to Moloch in Jerusalem. The statues and idols of the Baals and the Ashtoreths and so on and so forth adorned the street corners, adorned the homes of the multitudes, and great evil dwelt in the land. Where will you be stricken again as you continue in your rebellion? Verse 5. The whole head is sick and the whole heart is faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is nothing sound in it. Only bruises, wounds, and raw wounds, not pressed out, not bandaged, not soothed with oil. Their wickedness is open, public, and on full display, and the whole body has become corrupt, again in this dramatic hyperbolic sense, from the foot to the head. It has become corrupted to the core, like a cancer that spreads throughout the organs. Nothing has been left untouched by the evil that dwelt in this time. And this is still over 100 years before Babylon would march on Jerusalem and destroy her. There was still over a century of iniquity that would continue to play out. The reforms that Hezekiah would bring, which we've referenced in weeks past, would be disintegrated to the point where the last true king of Judah, King Josiah, whose reign ends in 609, which is the beginning of the Babylonian conquests, in his day, the reason why the reforms came about was because his high priest happened to find an old, dusty copy of the book of Deuteronomy lying in a pile of rubble and ash. The book of the covenant, the book of the law, was literally buried and lost and forgotten because no one had any care for God, for his covenant, for his law anymore. They had, as these words say here, forsaken the Lord, they had spurned the Holy One of Israel, and they had become estranged from him. And so upon that basis in verse 7, God then says through Isaiah, your land is desolate, your cities are burned with fire, your fields, foreigners are devouring them in your presence. It is desolate as overthrown by foreigners. Not only in the literal sense overthrown by foreigners, not only with the constant invasions from the Assyrians and from neighbouring petty kingdoms and those who are either in allegiance as vassal states to the Assyrian Empire or to Egypt or to neither. So literally in that sense overthrown and overrun and constantly invaded through by migration and by warfare, but also through, on top of that, foreign ideologies, the worship of those pagan nations that dwelt around them now flourished in their land. It was desolate, cities burned with fire. The daughter of Zion, which is the typical reference for Jerusalem in the Old Testament, the daughter of Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a watchman's hut in a field, like a besieged city. These are agrarian references, but long story short, it is talking about a place that has been reduced to utter insignificance and barrenness. Even to the point where in verse 9, unless the Lord of hosts had left a remnant or a people, we would be like Sodom, we would be like Gomorrah. Not merely in terms of the wickedness that dwelt in those two ancient cities, as referenced back in the book of Genesis, but particularly with regards here contextually to their destruction. Unless the Lord had left a remnant or a few survivors, we would be destroyed like Sodom and Gomorrah. And we would not simply be left because we, the chosen ones, as many in Isaiah's day so proclaimed, that somehow the justice of God would not come upon them. We see this over and over again. We see it not only in Isaiah's day, but we see it as the constant mindset and excuse of God's people in the Old Testament. That somehow they would be protected because they were in covenant, all the while forgetting, just as they did literally forget the book of Deuteronomy by the days of King Josiah, that with covenant blessings also come covenant curses. That there is justice that God brings upon people. Though his wrath and anger is slow to kindle, though he is immeasurably and undeservedly patient, the day of justice and the day of judgment does come. And it doesn't just only come in an eschatological sense, that is to say a final sense, as of course as the great day of judgment is to come, but it also comes in this world. There is also judgment that God brings upon evil and wickedness here, temporally, in the world in which we live. That it is not just something that will be escaped, that there are true and real consequences to evil and to wickedness. And so why do we work our way through reading a text like this in regards to the 6th command? Thou shalt not murder. Here in the time of these various kings and in the time essentially of Isaiah, all of the wickedness can ultimately be summarized, among other violations, of course, of the commandments, as a violation of this one. There was the literal physical murdering of people. There was the human sacrifice. There was the child sacrifice taking place, even to the point where King Ahaz himself sacrifices his own child, his own son, to Moloch, where he offers him into that brazen effigy. For those who are not aware, Moloch, one of the principal and indeed the national god of the Babylonians, demanded in his ritual cult the sacrifice of children for future betterment, particularly concerning wealth, concerning crops, concerning fertility, and a variety of other things ritually. And it involved the burning of your child. It involved offering him into the fire where he would be burnt alive, he or she. In this case, the very king of Israel offered his child, his son, and put him into the fire and sacrificed him in honor of Moloch, that he would receive benefit and fortune and riches and fame. There was the literal murdering, but also, again, the spirit of the law. There was the murderous intent and indeed murderous consequences with regards to all that is associated with God. Whilst, of course, God, the Lord, was worshipped, whilst his name had not been entirely extinguished, that's the entire point there of verse 9, unless the Lord of hosts had not left a few survivors, we would be like Sodom and Gomorrah. Whilst that was, of course, occurring, the overwhelming majority of the people, including those, and especially those, who still profess to be God's people, who still profess to be in the covenant, who still profess to be the sons and daughters of Abraham, they, through their idolatry, they, through their wickedness, through their evil, through their spiritual adultery, as we will look at when we get onto that command as well, murdered, killed off, put to death all that is good, all that is true, all that is beautiful in life. This is why we get these kinds of descriptions. Vivid, ecstatic, fiery, pointed, unapologetic, yet also much closer to the truth than we may initially conceive. Your lands being desolate, your cities being burned by fire, the people having forsaken the Lord, having spurned the Holy One of Israel, having forgotten him entirely. To abandon God and his covenant is to kill off all that comes with that covenant. It is to cut yourself off from the very source of life itself, from the one who is being, who is the fountain and source of all existence. This is why, just as a side point, we often balk and are confused or even perhaps offended by the notion that the just penalty for the violation of the first and the second command and the third and the fourth was death. That having other gods before God, in other words, worshipping other gods or making idols and the various commands we've seen thus far, brought about with it the only just penalty being that of capital punishment. In our modern day, it offends our Western sensibilities. But yet, no such sensibilities are to be found in the Scriptures, neither in the Old nor in the New. Why? To cut yourself off from God, to abandon him, to turn to the worship of that which is created, which by definition is all that apostasy or paganism is. God is the one who created all things. Outside of him, everything else is created. To turn to anything other than him is by definition to worship something or things in creation. It is the worship of creation itself. This is why, as we've explained many times before, the gods of the pagan nations, the Babylonian gods, the Egyptian pantheon, the Assyrian, the Greek, the Roman, the Persian, etc., all of them in their mythologies, in their what we call cosmologies or cosmogonies, their origin stories, their founding myths, all of the gods and the various generation of gods ultimately come forth from the creation, not the other way around. They do not create anything. They all come out of the creation. They all, in the case of the Greeks, the Titans as we refer to them, spring forth from Gaia or Gaia, the earth herself, so on and so forth. It is the worship of things which are apart from God and therefore that which has been created. That thing which itself, the creation, including us, including the very fabric of inanimate matter, is itself dependent on God. The trust and the confidence, as trivial as it may be, as unthinking as I'm sure almost every single one of you would have been when you sat down here this morning, the continued material composition of the pews in which you sit upon entirely and solely hinges upon the continued sustaining power and sovereignty of God. Your bones, your flesh, your blood, the very atomic composition of your body is held together by the God who gave you life in the first place. To worship things other than or beyond him is to cut yourself off from that source. It's to turn away from that source of life and being and existence to something else which itself is dependent on God for its existence. Apart from the philosophical or metaphysical foolishness, it brings death. The death penalty in regards to those violations of those commands of that first table, let alone anywhere else, is not just merely a matter of administration or bureaucracy. It is actually simply the demonstration and acceptance of the reality of what happens when you cut yourself off from the eternal, self-existent God, the one who is uncreated. It brings death, and that is to be reflected. It brings not merely physical death, but it brings spiritual death. Was it not Christ who indeed said, "Fear not he who can kill only the body, but rather he who can kill, who can destroy, who can condemn both body and soul to hell"? This metaphysical reality that I'm explaining and describing here is the foundation of this sixth command. against murder. It is not simply the murder of another human being's body, although that is, of course, the foremost and surface level example of that. The deeper spiritual weight behind that law is the murder of all that is good. It is the murder of all that is true. It's the murder of all that is beautiful. It is the murder of all that God himself has declared good and indeed very good. Not just in the physical material sense, but also in the abstract or the intellectual and spiritual sense also. It was Friedrich Nietzsche, the renowned and I suppose infamous, depending on who you're talking to, German philosopher of the mid to late 19th century, who in one of his more famous works declared that God is dead and we have killed him. It's often erroneously understood or interpreted, for those who have never read that text, to be a boastful, prideful claim, and usually it's rendered that way because of how often it had been quoted by atheists in his day and by those who have come over the last 100 to 150 years or so. But ironically, Nietzsche, who very much proclaimed this, and this is not a positive in his regard, it's simply an accurate explanation, wrote that work, which goes on and on in detail, but reaches its climax in that phrase, God is dead and we have killed him. He writes that as a lament. He writes it as a sad and tragic observation. And he actually goes on to, in that work and in other works, explain the horrors of what will befall Europe and indeed the world as a consequence of our killing off of God. And it is barely within a few decades that the First World War breaks out. And then the Second World War after it. And then every single other war that we've had, proxy, direct or otherwise, since. The grotesque immorality that now plagues every facet of our society, he also addressed. It is the irony that an atheist who himself essentially drove himself into madness, went insane by the end of his life, was arguably more prophetic, P-R-O-F-P-H, prophetic, than many of the Christian ministers of his day, than many of the Christian ministers since his day, who have rather instead compromised with the consequences of killing off God, with abandoning him, of destroying his memory, of removing him from our society, from our institutions, from our lives, of moving away from his teachings and his traditions and his statutes, proclaimed in the scriptures, lived out throughout the history and the life of the church, instead towards confusion as opposed to order, towards compromise as opposed to strength, instead of standing in the face of such an increase in apostasy, rather caving to it, rather accommodating it, rather laying down our sword and shield, all to gain and maintain significance and approval, the very things which I addressed in regards to the second commandment, and the idolization, the idolatry that we commit in seeking the approval of the enemies of God while compromising not just merely the teachings and the law of God and the morality of God, but indeed our very standing before him. This is what death is, and this is what death does. Just as in the days of Isaiah, murderous intent and murderous consequences abounded, so too do those things abound in our day. So too do we find ourselves amidst a culture of death, where death is permeated both materially or physically, as well as spiritually or ideologically. Even though, just as it was done in the days of Isaiah, it is done under the guise of truth, inverted commas, under the guise of tolerance, under the guise of compassion, under the guise of being on the right side of history. All of these things, just as in Isaiah's day, because I do not want you to be confused about something here. I don't want you to think, if you haven't read through those relevant texts in the book of the Kings, especially 2 Kings in recent memory, I don't want you to be under the illusion that the Israelites were doing this in a blatant and flagrantly dark fashion. What I mean by that is, the Israelites had absolutely convinced themselves, not only during Isaiah's day, but also before and also afterwards, that what they were doing did not somehow remove them from the covenant of God, that it didn't put them at enmity with him. There was no, broadly speaking, outside of isolated examples perhaps you can turn to like Jezebel and whatnot, there was no meaningful way of reading those texts to arrive at the conclusion that the people were solidly on the side of the Edomites or of the Philistines or of anyone else. No, they still fought against them. They still, when they went into war, apart from calling for the aid of other gods, also called for the aid of the Lord. They still absolutely maintained this conceptualization, culturally speaking, in their heads, that we are still the sons of Abraham, we're still the chosen ones, we're still the people of God. And those are the godless goyim out there, those are the enemies. Those are the pagans. The self-delusion that they were still right with God. You find that paralleled at any other time in history where such a thing has occurred. What we're going through now is not the first time that Christian nations have had this play out. It's not the first time that the church has ever encountered this. We're just up for the current round of it. But you still find that if you were to talk to your average person on the street who has no meaningful connection to the church, to Christianity, they have no meaningful connection to Christ, and they are either indifferent or antagonistic or somewhere in between. And if you ask them, are you a good person? The answer would almost never not be yes. It would be, of course, yes, I am. If you ask them, where will you go when you die? For the majority of people who still actually do believe in the afterlife, which ironically is still a prevailing view as far as we can tell, they will, without a question, say heaven. This is the exact same spiritual deception and delusion that prevailed in Isaiah's day. The texts are relatively clear. Like, there's no way of arriving at a conclusion that anyone in those days would have thought, I'm definitely, when I go to Sheol, I'm definitely not going to be with Abraham. Oh, I won't be with the righteous. No, they absolutely thought they would be. As they're in the middle of burning their infant son to a foreign god. As they're in the middle of conducting ritual temple prostitution in the temple courtyard and in the city and throughout the regions, etc., etc., etc. As they are killing and murdering not just merely what is good and true, but even the very memory of God. This is what you also need to see as the deepest level of this. It's the very memory of who God is. This plays out in this passage and in many, many others. That very passage from Isaiah itself, again, to remind you in verse 4, they have forsaken the Lord, they have spurned the Holy One of Israel, they have become estranged from him. And that's building up on the previous wording from the end of verse 3. My people do not know, my people do not perceive. They don't even know me anymore, even though they think they do, even though they claim to, even though they live as if they do. And this is not something that is just merely out there. It's one of the consistent things I've been saying week through week thus far during our time in the 10 Commandments. This is not something that we are victims of. This is something which the Western churches are absolutely culpable and guilty of participating in, of condoning, of, in certain minority instances, promoting, but in all senses, compromising with, and in actuality, aiding and abetting. Aiding and abetting. This is what we have done. This is what we have become. It's very reminiscent of the words that the words that Christ gives in John chapter 10, for example. You can turn there. I'm only going to reference it in passing, but if you want to turn there, you can read along as well. But in John chapter 10, the Gospel of John, is where we find in the first kind of 15 plus verses or so, a very specific parable. It's an agrarian one, and where he's referencing shepherdry, right, and sheep and a fold and wolves that attack and so on and so forth. And in the first about 7 verses or so, he is explaining the nature of the sheep pen and the shepherd who's moving around, especially in a nomadic sense, right, moving from pasture to pasture, depending, of course, on how good and viable the terrain was. But nevertheless, moving around, and for us in the 21st century, so largely disconnected, especially in urban environments as we are from the agrarian lifestyle of rural territories, we have to kind of bridge the gap of our understanding. For shepherding or shepherdry, which was of vital significance throughout the history of the world, still is in many places in the world, shepherds moving around, especially in those ancient times, from pasture to pasture, looking for enough decent land to be able to then feed the flock, of course, depending on the size of the flock. Bigger the flock, the more difficult the job. Often you may require more than one shepherd, but nevertheless, it would often be a lone shepherd. This is much like David was in his day before, of course, all the rest of his life unfolds and his ascension to the throne and whatnot. But you would find that building a temporary pen, as it was, to be able to corral your sheep and keep them in a location, to give them some protection from natural elements, from particularly other such natural predators, wolves, and especially in the ancient world, lions and other such things which dwelt in the ancient Near Eastern world. But you would still nevertheless have this gap. You would have to have a place for the sheep to come in and out of the fence line or the pen that you'd created. And often, not always, but certainly often, and this is part of his reference in this parable, that they would have immediately understood, often the shepherd would have to be able to guard that entranceway. Okay. And at times, again, not always, but at times he would, if he needed to be able to sleep, if they were in a safe enough area, he would actually lie down right in front of that gate. He would literally and figuratively, I suppose, put his body on the line. He would literally guard them with his body. He would lay down his life in their defense. And this is the language and the rhetoric that then Christ picks up on in this particular parable. And so what he then goes on to say from verse essentially 7 onward, he says this: "So Jesus said to them again, 'Truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep.'" What I was just referencing. "All who come before me are thieves and robbers." He's referring to the many false Christs that arose in his day. It doesn't often get mentioned. It gets mentioned in passing in the scriptures, and if you're not kind of paying attention, you can miss it. But even extra-biblical sources from that time among the Jews and even the Romans explain that there were many people, this giant cluster in the first century, that arose right around the time when Christ was born, of people claiming to be the Messiah. When Jesus was alive and ministering, he was not the only person claiming to be the Messiah. Okay, it gets referenced in passing, and more came after his ascension. He hearkens to this, of course, in the Olivet Discourse. Many antichrists or Christs will arise in my position or in my name, but they're false. Don't follow them. All that warning that gets given, and we see that play out throughout the decades that follow. We've seen it a bit in regards to our Bible study in Acts as well. But here he is explaining that all who come before me are thieves and robbers. They're here to bring falsehood, okay? But the sheep did not hear them. The disciples followed him. "I am the door, and if anyone enters through me, he will be saved, and he will go in and out and find pasture. He'll find good, nutrient-rich soil that produces food, grass, etc., that he's able to live off of. He will find life growing, okay, as opposed to death and barrenness, the kind of wilderness that gets explained and explored in the Psalms. Right? The valley of the shadow of death is a reference in part to the barren wilderness that often shepherds would have to avoid lest they befall bandits, lest they befall thieves, lest they befall wild beasts and every other threat that dwelt there. Verse 10, "The thief comes only to steal and to kill and to destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." The thief comes to kill, to destroy, etc. I came to bring life, and that the sheep of God who hear my voice and who know me," which is what he goes on to say, "that they will have life abundantly." Spiritual life. And all the blessings of God that flow forth from that spiritual life in this life and in the next. But I want you to pick up on what's being said there in that specific verse 10. He's making a very deep and profound ontological remark, in other words, with regards to the nature of these two opposing things. He's comparing and contrasting himself to thieves, and we'll explain what that means in a minute, and to him. Okay? As we read on, that'll illuminate for us what's being referenced there by these two concepts. Okay, so let's keep reading verse 11. "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." This is what I referenced to earlier. The shepherd would literally lay down his life for the sheep. He would use his body and his life as essentially a guard of that place in which the sheep would go in and out of the pasture. He would lay down his life literally for the sheep, with the knowledge that he could die, with the knowledge that he could be attacked, that he could be mortally wounded, etc. And he's picking up on this deeply profound and prophetic language, this poetic language, here in the parable. "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." In contrast, verse 12, he who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them up and scatters them, because he is a hired hand, he is not concerned about the sheep. He's talking about those specifically, and Paul and the other apostles go on to explain this as well. The New Testament unfolds this concept more deeply and profoundly. But in simple terms, this hired hand is one who is put in the place of the shepherd, the one who is actually been entrusted with doing the job. This is why, for example, later on, St. Paul refers to the ministers of the church as shepherds. That's where that term pastor comes from. Specifically, it's not technically a title, it's a descriptor, but nevertheless it's been applied as a title across the history of the church. And it's describing that shepherding element. It's just one of the many words that are used to describe the role of the ministers of God's church. And that element of shepherding, or as an under-shepherd, so we're under the good shepherd or the great shepherd, is an image that then St. Paul plays out himself. Upon that basis, and upon this basis here, this hired hand is one who is actually meant to be guarding and protecting the flock, one who's meant to follow the good and great shepherd that Christ is describing himself as in verse 11, but who in fact proves himself to be a hired hand, someone who took essentially a contracting job, so it were, who got a quick buck, got paid for it, but then when push came to shove, when the rubber hit the road, when it got too hot in the kitchen, or any other English idiom I could throw out there, he bolts. Right? When it's time for the shepherd to pick up his staff, which on the one hand is able to guide and direct the sheep, to keep them in line, to move them, to stop them from falling off a cliff, to stop them from falling into a ravine, to stop them from falling into some hazard or trap, right? Not to smother them, not to tyrannize them, not to oppress them, but to guide them and keep them on the right path. That staff on the other end was very sharp. And that staff on the other end would pierce through the head of a wolf or through the heart of bandits, of thieves, of robbers, of those who come to kill and to destroy, which is exactly the reference that we have there earlier on in verse 10. We like the guidance part often. I'm saying this gently and nicely. We like the guidance part, we like that pastoral, that nicer element, the more soft and tender caring element. But I would submit that we have largely, and by largely I mean overwhelmingly, lost the reality of the very vital and equally important component of what a shepherd is in that biblical kind of agrarian motif. A guardian, a defender, a protector, one who is not afraid, who is indeed willing to drive a sharp object straight through the skull of wolves. One who is willing, like the predecessor of this great shepherd, a man who was himself a shepherd, an ancestor of Christ, King David, who is willing to confront the gigantic enemy of God, who all day upon the battlefield has been taunting not only God's people, but also, more importantly, mocking God, mocking the Lord, speaking great blasphemies with a poisonous tongue, and is then willing to step forth even though he was not big enough, not strong enough compared to those around him, even though those who were meant to be his superiors, the king and his brothers and everyone else, many of whom were seasoned warriors on the surface, who proved themselves to be cowards in that day, God raised up the comparatively younger shepherd who very much knew how to wield a slingshot. A slingshot which he no doubt used many times in the defense of his flock and of his sheep. One who is described throughout the Bible as having killed many wild beasts, which is very normal and typical in the context of an ancient shepherd. And who then steps upon that battlefield, doesn't cower, doesn't run away like the rest of the army was, instead walks out to challenge the champion of Philistia in single combat. And that entire chapter unfolds and explains all the rhetoric and the speech that David gives. And nowhere in the text, again, this is how the element of perception, this is why we need to be able to read these things in context and with wisdom, right? Often the story of David and Goliath, apart from being very butchered often into the point where basically you're David and your problems are Goliath, in that story we often perceive it, at least in my experience, often perceive that story of David and Goliath as David being absolutely petrified out of his mind and somehow pulling off basically a miracle shot. In fact, I've almost never not heard a sermon that has been basically a rendering of that concept to one degree or another. What's fascinating when you actually read that text is that that's not the image that's ever presented. No. The armour is too big and too heavy for him. He is a young man in his teens, as would be the age at that time for a young man. The armour too big, too heavy. And so he sticks to the tools that he knows. He sticks to that slingshot, which he was trained well on. And he is walking out into single combat and against an extremely capable warrior, a man who had slayed many men, and a man who was the champion of Philistia for a very good reason. Okay, who is adorned in some of the best armour of that time, who is giant, who is terrifying, who has been taunting God and his people all day. And he replies to him, and to paraphrase, he explains and he proclaims, not only before the Israelite army, but also before the army of the Philistines, you will not mock God, and your tongue will go quiet today. The Lord God of Israel will destroy you, and I will bring your death, and your gods will fall, and they will be destroyed. And the one true God will prevail this day, and the people here will bear witness. He then does exactly what he knew how to do. He actually enacts his training. The shot that, functionally speaking, kills Goliath, that certainly at least knocks him out, as far as the reading of the text is concerned, was of course guided by God, and this is not to remove the glory from God, but it wasn't some child who picked up the nearest object and somehow pulled off a miracle. No, he did his job. He did what he was trained to do. And then having neutralized Goliath, he then walks up, picks up his own sword, cuts off his head, raises it to the heavens, and proclaims the glory of God. That is what the scriptures uphold as the archetype of a good, righteous, loving, compassionate king, ruler, man of God, of a Christian. And he is hailed and heralded not only in that day, but in every day since throughout the scriptures, and the scriptures have no other concept other than that. Do we have that same view? Do we have that same view of what it means to fight against evil, against murder? Not only murder in the physical sense, but murder in the spiritual sense. Against the enemies of God, outside or within the four walls of the church, who ultimately either directly or indirectly bring and seed and grow and metastasize death. Who through compromise murder the honour of God, murder the law of God, murder the love of God. Who through compromising with false ideologies, with foreign ideologies, either literally with foreign ideologies from those far off and distant to Christian lands, or those which have arisen within Christian lands, which are foreign to Christendom, to the kingdom of God, to the church. Do we have that view of what actually constitutes someone who does good in the face of that? Because I would submit that we don't. I would submit that in our time, we place a very high premium on nice, dainty, soft, weak, effeminate, cowardly people. Not only in the pews, but arguably more impactfully in the pulpit. I would argue that we have held up on a pedestal for the better part of a century now those who are soft and nuanced, those who are nice, those who make sure that they don't offend, don't rock the boat, those who don't shake things up too much, don't cause any trouble, make sure that we don't lose our esteemed positions in academia, make sure that we don't lose our renowned places in the corporate world, make sure that we don't offend or otherwise slight the various different political institutions or groups or activities that we're connected to. Make sure that we keep people in the seats, make sure we keep the money flowing, make sure that our budget is ever growing, make sure that people feel nice and comfortable when they come, make sure you don't say anything that's going to actually, genuinely help someone, actually speak the truth to them. No, make sure that we just simply make them nice and comfortable at all costs. So this is my whole point about depth. We think of those as incidental or otherwise auxiliary things. They're not. They're not. They're murder. That compromise brings death. The hired hand gets sheep killed. Do you understand? As soon as trouble comes, he bolts. And the pasture, the door, is left wide open. And the wolves waltz on in and devour the sheep. His compromise causes death. He didn't slaughter a single wolf. He didn't slaughter a single sheep. He didn't slaughter anyone. His cowardice brought death. And in that analogy, in that parable, the wolf, this symbol of evil throughout the ancient world for very obvious reasons as a predator, the wolf did exactly what you'd expect a wolf to do, right? The wolf acted exactly according to its nature. Again, in this parabolic sense, or in this figurative sense here, this symbolic sense, evil, darkness, death, right? Ferociousness. Right? The wolf did exactly what you'd expect the wolf to do. That doesn't justify it, but there's nothing at all surprising about the wolves in these analogies. Instead, though, who's held in the position of blame in this parable by Christ? It's not even the wolf, even though the wolf, of course, is guilty. It's actually the hired hand. So who causes the death of those sheep? Who causes the slaughter that comes upon and befalls that flock? Ultimately, it's the hired hand. It's the person who's been entrusted to defend, to protect, to guide, to lead, etc. But who flees, who compromises, who abandons, he's the murderer. And he will be judged as a murderer. He will be judged for the blood that is spilt upon the otherwise white wool of the sheep. And that blood will reside upon his hands. This is why, just to reference another portion, you're able to turn it if you want to, but I'll reference it in passing. It's from Proverbs chapter 24. It's in verses 11 and 12. Here the wise man says, "If you are slack in the day of adversity, your strength is in trouble." If you are slack, if you're passive, that word gets translated a variety of different ways into English. If you are soft, if you compromise, if you abandon, all these kind of concepts you get played out in the Hebrew there or in the Greek. If you slack in the day of adversity, in the day of trouble, your strength is in trouble. Okay? And strength there is talking about not just merely the strength of your spirit, but also your standing before God is the more figurative way in which that word gets used. Immediately after that, verse 11, "Rescue those who are being taken away to death, and those who are stumbling toward the slaughter, hold them back." If you say, "But we did not know this," if you come with excuse, if you say, "Oh, but Lord, Lord, did we not do many wondrous works? Did we not teach? Did we not prophesy? Did we not even raise from the dead?" I will say to you, "I never knew you. Depart from me, you worker of iniquity." In this rendering here, if you say, "Behold, we didn't know this," does not he who weighs the hearts understand? And does not he who guards your soul know? And will not he render to man according to his works? Those who are slack, those who faint, those who compromise, those who abandon in the day of adversity, in the day of trouble, in the day of war, in the day when evil abounds, in the day when God's people are at warfare, for we are at warfare, your strength is in trouble. Your standing before God is on shaky ground. The constant command throughout the Old Testament, which comes through in Deuteronomy, which comes through, of course, probably most famously in the beginning of Joshua, the successor of Moses, be strong and courageous. It's always paralleled with a negative command against. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. How do you make sure that you are not afraid nor discouraged? Be strong and courageous. That's the entire point. We are, by definition, mortal. We fail before God. We do the things we don't want to do, and we don't do the things we want to do, says the Apostle St. Paul. But despite that very clear reality, and despite the very clear reality that we are mortal and that we are flawed, and that we are utterly dependent in every possible way upon the grace of God, the Scriptures have no concept, again, that it is acceptable or that it is otherwise permissible or okay to be weak, to be afraid, to be, to use that ultimate word, cowardly. In fact, consistently, those who are cowardly, those who are like the hired hand, for example, are condemned. Those who are effeminate, speaking of men specifically and particularly leaders, but men generally, are likewise condemned. There is no concept that it's okay to be those things, unrepentantly and unchangingly. No, we're called to rise by the grace of God. We're called by His power, through the union and communion of His Spirit, to be strong and to be courageous. And there are times where strength and courage looks like helping in love and compassion our own brothers and sisters in need, offering a kind word, extending the forgiveness of God which we have all received for those who have submitted unto Christ. That's where strength and courage absolutely plays out. And generally speaking, we tend to have that fairly central in our understanding. It's not something generally that we struggle with. Struggling to do it is one question, but struggling to understand it is not something which we are plagued with. What we are plagued with is the failure to understand that strength and courage also looks like cutting the head off the enemy of God, of driving your sword through the heart of a wolf. And we wrestle, of course, not against flesh and blood primarily, but against spiritual powers, against principalities and dominions, forces of darkness, which corrupt and pervade ideologically and spiritually and so on. But light doesn't overcome darkness by hiding away, does it? No. This culture of death which you are ingratiated in, which your children and your grandchildren will be raised in and are being raised in, which they are being perpetrated and promulgated upon through their schools, through their sports, through the media, through the various different technological avenues that they have access to, where all these things ultimately cut off from God and bring the death and the decay and the destruction that comes from cutting yourself off from the source of life. This you need to guard them from. Do not think that, again, I'm speaking on aggregate here or in average, do not think that the days of your work in this world are over. Do not think that you don't have an extremely important role in not only your personal lives, but in the lives of your families, in the lives of your church here, in the lives of your community, where we combat this culture of death by the absolute allegiance and commitment to the life of Christ. To Christ, who is the source of life, to Christ, whose death, burial, and resurrection brings life and grants life, not only in the next life, but in this life, and whose blessings overflow like rivers of living water. That as those who come into the church, those who come to the temple of God, which is what God's people are, to use that parable that Christ explains, coming to the great mountain of God, which is growing and which started off small like a rock or a boulder, but is growing to fill the whole earth, which flows forth with rivers of living water, Christ and his blessings, which all the nations ascend and come up to drink of that living water. The absolute commitment to the promotion of life, physically, spiritually, and otherwise. It involves commitment to drive out death and all that is consequent of darkness and of evil in your personal life. To drive out death in the midst of your family. To drive out deception and sin. To work to defend the truth of God in the church, which is not just my job, which is not just Pastor Michael's job, but is all of our jobs, collectively and together. To drive it out in our communities. to not hide in the four walls of the church, but actually to get out on the battlefield, which is the world. That is what our call is. To not listen and to not follow, and in fact at this point I should probably be saying in the context of our age, to stop listening and to stop following cowards. Stop buying their books, stop listening to their sermons, stop buying things from them, stop promoting them, stop listening to them. People who up here, men, or even these days now, women, who are doing nothing other than compromising, nothing other than aiding and abetting, nothing other than allowing foreign ideology to seep in, to penetrate, and to absolutely corrupt the foundation of the church. Everything. And I could be here all day listing all those various isms and phobias which get listed as the foundation of our new Western religion. Stop following cowards. And if the day comes when I, or anyone else here, were to become a coward and to stop fighting and to compromise, the door's right there. And you should walk out. And vote with your proverbial feet. Stop listening to cowards. Because those of my peers who are so will be judged for it upon the day of judgment. And so upon that basis, do not murder. And do not compromise with murderers, not only physically, who bring death, who bring decay upon society, who enact policies that bring about the destruction of our nation and the destruction of Christians and the destruction of our people. But also those who enact with and compromise with those who bring death spiritually. For if we fight for the glory of God, by the grace of God, then we will win. And that is how life overcomes death. That is how we win. Not by our own might, but by the grace of God. And by the source of life himself, Jesus Christ. Amen.